My name is Ray Waters. I'm sure you know Stan Mitchell. Stan's been here for a long, long time. I'm Ray. I pastor a church in Atlanta called the Village Church. And we were an evangelical church trying to just do it like everybody else was doing it. And then a funny thing happened, and we realized inclusion should be a part of our story, and we repented, and we got on that train, and it was an exciting train. And I became friends with Stan Mitchell, who was doing the same thing at GracePointe. And we kind of just began to talk. And he would come into town, and we would talk about not only inclusion, which is what it was starting with us, but also theology, how those things were changing. I went to a Southern Baptist University, Southern Baptist Seminary, was evangelical to the core, but things that I had thought were so sacrosanct, I just thought this is it. Those things were beginning to unravel a little bit. And Stan was so good at us just talking and him just kind of sharing with me kind of the process he was going through. And so as we were doing that, I think I became so excited, but what I discovered was church was suddenly different than what I had known, and I didn't know exactly what to do with our church. It was changing. Get us into that, because I think that's kind of what we're supposed to talk about.
The message and the method were correlative.
Right.
We didn't have this capacity to just change and impact the message and go back to the same method.
Right.
I mean, you hear people say all the time, the method is the message. It's at least a part of the message. The reality is there's a scripture that I wanted to share with you guys because I think this scripture really at least provokes the conversation, and not to sell ourselves short or to take the easy way out. But what I want to talk about today is something that I don't feel in any sense I or anyone else has the answer to. I remember the days of good religion. Good religion was trying to come up with all the right answers, right? But healthy spirituality is actually developing and cultivating better questions. And I don't think that's a cop-out. I really think the reality is we've got to find better questions. The first stage of deconstruction for me was, wait a minute, all of these memorized answers that I can regurgitate are other people's answers to life's questions. Right. And so that first stage of deconstruction was finding the courage to say, no, I need to find my own answers to these questions. Man, Anna, I remember when after 5 or 10 years of reading every book I could, trying to totally develop a new theology, a new lens, and come up with all these new right answers, I remember it was disheartening when I began to realize these aren't even the right questions. Maybe right is the wrong word. These aren't even my questions. So not only am I trying to find right answers, the reality is I was trying to find right answers to, for me, the wrong questions. Right. So I said, well, I've got to find the right questions. And then I had this perfectionistic pursuit of what the right questions are, and that's been an unending process. Right. So we've all gone through that deconstructive thing. But those of us that were in pastoral leadership, there was this other nagging piece for us. And that is, while we're on this exhilarating, horrifying journey to think differently about God, the big six for me, coming from an evangelical background, were God, Jesus, humanity, salvation, the afterlife, and the Bible. I mean, think about that. God, Jesus, salvation, humanity, the afterlife, and the Bible. It was an exhilarating process, reading every Barbara Brown Taylor, Diana Butler Bass, Brian McLaren. We were all reading it. It was an exhilarating process. But there was a non-exhilarating part to the process, an onerous, burdensome part to the process that I didn't immediately acknowledge. I almost said I didn't immediately recognize it. I immediately recognized it, but I didn't want to acknowledge it. And that was this very deeply personal, exhilarating spiritual journey to thinking better thoughts about God, and better thoughts about Jesus, and better thoughts about the afterlife and humanity and creation. It was accompanied by a severe impact on my vocation. a severe impact on the medium through which I had always conveyed that message. And that was the medium of the local church in which I worked. There's no way around the correlation. And I don't say this tongue-in-cheek. I don't say it with any answers. I just say it straight up empirically. For myself and almost everybody I know, sitting here, I can look out at them, there was a direct correlation, Jeff, to the better we thought about God and people, the smaller our churches got.
That is true. That is true.
Is there any denying that fact? And that had implications for my own psychological health, the ego work that's involved there. It had huge implications because most evangelicals, it takes a season of pain and suffering and just time. You're generally getting to the precipice of that kind of deconstruction at midlife, which is correlative to your vocation settling into a place where you can make a mortgage payment and put your kids through college. And so there was the ego work, there was the practical financial side of it, and then there was the grief work of feeling like all of these better thoughts about God, I was now desecrating them professionally because the church was getting smaller and smaller. So I'm having to deal with this dissonance of I'm saying better things about God, better things about people, and there's no way around it and no way to sanitize and sterilize it. Fewer people are listening. And we started selling our buildings, shutting down our churches. And so in the process of that conversation, you and I remember we were, the first 4 or 5 years were exhilarating and fun. We were trying to do our best. We were getting awards from people, all us cis, white, heterosexual saviors were getting awards. It was just as gross as it had ever been, and we didn't realize it. But
it was fun.
It was fun. It was fun. It was pathetically fun. And then we realized that the grossness of that was this, and I say it all the time. We were getting awards like we had done something wonderful. We had not done something wonderful. We had simply stopped doing something awful.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing, Colby? We got awards because we stopped doing something awful. And that's when GracePointe, we went all the way back. We realized the first 4 years, we were saying these self-congratulatory, patronizing things like we at GracePointe had finally welcomed our queer siblings to the table. And it hit us. I remember it was one of our elders it hit. We did not invite them to the table. We finally joined them. If you know anything about the dietary habits and the ethic of Jesus, guys, we may have had the building and crackers and grape juice. We did not have the Eucharist. They were already at that table. We joined them, but somehow we had flipped the script to we had invited them to the Lord's table. So we were going through a lot, and that's not what I want to talk about today, but that's what we were going through. But there was this other burdensome element that was nagging that I tried to avoid, and I just tried to bury my head in the sand and think it's going to go away and fix itself. That a new and better message was not accompanied with churches that were flourishing, and the narcissism of this post-evangelical iteration of progressive liberal Christianity, which we are only, the post-evangelical, those that come from Assembly of God, Baptist, Nazarene, Church of Christ, those of us that found Tony Campolo and then Philip Yancey and then Brian McLaren and then Rob Bell, this new wave, we acted like we were the first ones to find this information. We didn't know Schleiermacher was talking about this in the 1820s. We ignored that there were unity and Unitarian and mainline. We ignored all of those. We're the fifth iteration in a 240-year process of spiritual religious development. But I realized when I got out of that narcissism, there was some comfort in the misery because I found that my religious science, unity, Unitarian, and even mainline, those closest to us, there was a lot of resonance. They weren't knocking the ball out of the park in attendance figures either. And you and I facing that, sold our 20-acre campus, wrote a few thousand people down to a few hundred, thinking better thoughts about God. You guys doing the same thing. You pastored at the Village for 30 years. And one day, Ray and I was sitting, and we are Jesus people. I am. Ray is. And it occurred to me that Jesus had talked about this very thing. And I just wanted just to throw this out at the Goose, and we can open it up and we can talk about it some today. But I think, let me just read the scripture and I'll tell you what I think about it and then see what you guys think. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And people came and said to Jesus, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples don't?" Jesus said to them, "The wedding attendants cannot fast while the bridegroom is with them. As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come, though, when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day." No implication that there's a right or wrong. It's just a timing issue. No one, Jesus said, well, he's being very positive here because when he says no one does this, we did, and we are. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak. If they do, the patch, the unshrunk patch, will pull away from the old cloak, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. Similarly, no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins and the wine is lost. Listen to this. And so are the skins. Jesus wasn't even condemning the skins. He said the sadness is you lose the new wine and you do a disservice to an old wineskin that served its purpose in its day and does not deserve to be denigrated. It's pretty gracious of Jesus. No one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins and the wine is lost, and so are the skins. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. And this is what I wanted to say. So after coming to this stifling crossroads that really felt like it was leading to nowhere except despair in me, because it really is a mind, a heart, you know what, for those of us that have devoted our life to this, imperfectly, but decently and reasonably, sincerely, I think as much as we could with all of our mixed motives, devoted our life to it, Colby. To be shutting down the very medium that we hoped to bring this new wine through. And as much as we love the wine, there is no doubt for me, I have also loved and been sentimentally attached to the wineskin. I am a sentimentalist. I am a nostalgic person. I'm not an iconoclast. I don't look to replace words like holiness and sin with new words. Some do, and I totally get the psychology of that. But I think it's more about psychology than theology, personally. As Frederick Buechner said, if theology has three parts, at least two of them are personal autobiography and personality. I'm nostalgic, and it's been a real grief process for me. But what I did to help with my grief, to assuage my grief, as C.S. Lewis said, we read to find out that we're not alone. I began researching reform movements. And as best as I can say it, you guys don't need spoon-fed. You'll get what I'm saying here. Reform movements have a common denominator, a common variable, a common proclivity. Reform movements are almost always led predominantly by winemakers and wine growers, not wineskin distributors or creators. Let me say it better. If the wine is the spirit that is ever revivifying itself and reinventing itself, if there is ever and always a vine that can last thousands of years and spit out new variations of grape and give you, because of soil and cosmology and topography and meteorology, somehow the climate changes and an old vine spits out a new Malbec or a new Merlot. Reform movements, ideological, theological reform movements are always led by people who love that process. They are poets, they are artists, they are deep thinkers. They are looking for that new grape. They are tasting the hint of gunpowder on the back of their palate as they swirl the wine of the Spirit in their mouth and their soul. But let me say it as plain as I can say it. Jesus said there are two components to this story. Not only does there have to be an ever-ready awareness for that new wine and an openness to that new wine, that new grape. But Jesus said you have to know that if you put that new living grape wine, if you put it back into the same old delivery system that you had always used, that old delivery system does not have the capacity to match the elasticity and the growth of this new wine. And Jesus said, two things are going to happen. You're going to experience what has depressed me, and that is watching $1,000 wine spill on the ground and not be drunk. And the second thing for nostalgic people like me that some iconoclasts don't care about is Jesus said when you put the new wine in the old wineskin, it will even tear it and destroy it and cause a grief there that is undue, unseemly, and unnecessary. So Jesus said you gotta find new wineskins. You gotta find new ways of producing, marketing, and distributing that are just as creative and are just as alive and are just as innovative and just as new and fresh as this new variation of wine. And I want to say this about 98% of the people like Ray and me, reform movement leaders are great winemakers, but when it comes to the distribution, marketing, and production and the wineskin side of things, let me say this theologically, we can't find our butt with both hands tied behind our back.
That's true.
But we avoid this conversation, Skip, to our own peril. And right now, the academic subject that I'm talking about is ecclesiology. How do we gather and how do we distribute the good news? That we all now feel like, I'm telling you, the version that I now have is so much better than the United Pentecostal version that I grew up with. And you could say the same thing about yours. But my ecclesiology and my distribution admittedly has not kept up. And I think the easy road is for people like us to lick our wounds, avoid the subject, and just keep talking about new theories of substitutionary penal atonement, when the real work is on the wineskin side. To that end, I'm now pastor emeritus at GracePointe. Josh is lead pastor. I'm still a part of the church. Love being there. Was there last Sunday. I did pastoral ministry from 1985 to 2019 when I left and became pastor emeritus. A lot of you know what I do now. So I did pastoral ministry for 34 years in a local church, Wineskin. I love GracePointe. I love the local church. The last 4 years of my life, the level of spiritual help and pastoral ministry that I am able to do exceeds threefold anything I ever experienced in the local church. And every day, even when I go home to my church, GracePointe, people walk up to me and say, people who follow everything I do on Facebook, who tacitly know, my own people walk up to me and say, you ever think you'll get back into pastoral ministry? They say to me all the time, Kobe, what are you doing now? And I think we laugh to keep from crying because that simple exchange is at the heart of this conversation. John Pavlovich just walked off stage, and John gets asked all the time, do you miss pastoral ministry?
Yeah.
We don't even know how to recognize the new wineskin when it's developing. And I think it's an important conversation. So
Oh, it is. As you were talking, back in 1987, a long time ago, went through a divorce, and pretty much from my background, ministry was over, not an option, wasn't a question, it was through. And so I kind of fumbled around for a few years trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do, what's my life going to be like. And I come from a background that's not like, I can't tell you God spoke to me very many times. But one time I sensed God say, Ray, one day you will be a pastor to people who don't have a pastor. And I didn't even know what that meant because I only understood the church context. I'd pastored 3 churches. That's all I knew. And so I began to do funerals for people whose families didn't have a pastor, and began to do weddings for people whose families didn't have a pastor. It was kind of cool stuff. And then I started the Village Church. 30 years ago, started the Village Church. And then I kind of got into the church rhythm, and it was I was pastored the people that were in the church. That was my job, and it was fun, and it grew, and it was experience like many of you know. And then when the inclusion happened and the attendance began to fall, and I couldn't figure out what was happening, but it has driven me back to what I believe God spoke to me almost 40 years ago, when I sensed I'm pastoring people now that I never dreamed I would be pastoring. I'm pastoring online, which is what you do, amazing, but I'm pastoring people online. People are meeting with me that are not a part of our church. I think I'm beginning to see that I'm not just pastoring that group on Sunday morning. I am pastoring kind of Atlanta at large for people that don't have churches like the Village. And maybe some of them do come. Matthew and Alejandro started coming. One of the greatest things in the world is to have them show up at our church, and they bring people, and that's incredible. But I'm trying not to judge ministry by our attendance on Sunday morning, because that makes me want to jump off a bridge sometimes. It's like I just feel so defeated. Like, how is this the end of my career? Less people than I ever dreamed that we would have actually in the auditorium. So I appreciate the conversation. I think many of us are wondering, what do we do?
yeah. So to you guys, yeah.
Yeah, we have a situation. It's a old wine, or an old wineskin, new wine situation. 15 years ago, or about 20 years ago, got a gay pastor in our church, and we went through the open and affirming process. Now it seems like we're at a point where everybody has checked the box and gone to sleep. And it's almost like we're now living in the results of an old wineskin that we tried to put new wine in. And the church doesn't know what to do. So that's my comment, and I don't even know.
Yeah, I don't think there's an answer, but these are the kind of comments I'm looking for. I think about our friend Amy Butler, what she's doing right now, helping churches, quote, who have come to the end of their institutional life, steward their resources. Think about that. I was just in Boulder, Colorado. I was telling Ray, First Baptist Church Boulder has now done full inclusion. It's great. First Baptist done full inclusion. I walked around Boulder. Diane and I walked around Boulder. First Methodist, First Lutheran, First Episcopal, First Congregational, the typical downtown in a hoity-toity rich part of Denver, 7 mainline churches that occupy the entire downtown with acreage, running between 40 to 70 people on Sunday, with anywhere from 60 to 200,000 square foot of space. I mean, we are this close to Europe's cathedrals becoming museums. And yet at the same time, the wine, I mean, we're here, aren't we? Because the wine is getting better and better and better and better. So how do we deal with the dissonance of the wine getting better and the grief? I mean, think about Jesus' analogy. Even the wineskin analogy is defunct. He never fathomed that they replaced wineskins with bottles. How about boxes with bladders in them? I mean, the conversation just keeps expanding. I mean, anybody else? I need to get Colby. When are you going to get back to pastoring? Hey, Anna, when are you going to get back to pastoring? And yet, right now in evangelical circles, they're doing better ecclesiology work than we are. If you really want innovative stuff about the structure of distribution, am I getting too far out? If you want to innovate, you got to go to evangelical people. They're doing better work than we are. We are lost. It's really true. Evangelicals who get to drink for the first time become drunks. And that's physically true, because I have a lot of pastor friends wrestling with that right now, because we're like poor Kansas farmers who won the lottery and don't know how to spend their money. Didn't drink for 45 years, so there's really an analogy there. I'm sorry? Distribution, the proclamation of the gospel, the getting it out there. Yes?
So my question is,
Can you use that? Yes.
so my question is, I'm in the UCC. This is my minister who has all the struggle. I just go.
Right.
But using the wine analogy, and I don't think there's an answer, but I'm throwing it out there. Wine is best for some. I can project. Wine is best for some when it sits in the cellar forever and it's their collection and they tell you that's the best. And so those folks are in your space who cherish that. And then you have your new winemakers. And so the balance, that's the piece that I think you're struggling. Yes, that's what our pastor's struggling with. That's what we're struggling with is, as you say, winemakers.
Sorry. Yes, I want to tell you something. Thanks for struggling through the microphone there. What you were saying right then was extending the metaphor. Eugene Peterson wisely said the missing piece in the modern Christian hermeneutic is imagination. Of course, evangelicalism, we didn't teach imagination. We had to mine for the original meaning. We didn't think that even the text was a new wine. To take that and begin imaginatively thinking just what you just said, I thought, I'll be dang, we are. We have these vintage collections that are never to be drunk. And actually, some of them, when you uncap them, have spoiled. And we were feeling good about ourselves with them and our wine collection. There's a lot to that metaphor. Anna, come up here.
Yeah, I want to respond to you. I'm curious. One of the things that I've seen a lot with progressive congregations and denominations, quite frankly, who kind of process through this O&A or, inclusion process, reconciling process over the course of the last 20 years, is that they did so within the confines of their still predominantly white traditions. And quite frankly, it is the whiteness of our traditions that has caused us to maintain power structures and systems that won't allow us to get out of our own ways around inclusion. Like we feel like we've accomplished the queerness checkbox. And because we're protesting in the streets, we've accomplished the justice checkbox. But we haven't accomplished the power dynamic that comes with us being white Christians in a space where Christianity is not just for all, but was set up by black and brown folks that never looked like us in the first place. And so, I'm curious. I think that might be part of the challenge that you all are up against, is that you changed pieces of your structure and you put new wine into old wineskin, but that old wineskin was riddled with racism and white supremacy and structures that are hindering growth in 2023 that are taking down churches all across the country. And they're taking down churches that have accept inclusion and churches that haven't. And so that's a universal challenge that those of us that consider ourselves progressive never thought we'd be up against, because we thought if we did it the same way we've always done it, piece by piece, we wouldn't have to deal with our own anti-racism work.
Stay here. So a bunch of cishet white males thinking that the wineskin issue is whether we keep doing Sunday morning and how we do church. That is a huge comment. That's not even touching what the wineskin issue. Sunday morning church probably isn't the problem. Right. It's the deeper structures. And isn't it interesting that insidiously we have a way as animals in that lizard brain to even righteously continue to maintain that which is self-serving, which is exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, I think, if we are really to understand queerness, the queering of our spaces should be the queering of our racism too, and it should be the queering of our tendencies and our proclivities to be people who need to maintain control or whose egos are challenged by a smaller number of people in our seats than we're used to. It's just interesting to me how we. Some of you have heard this, I was able to participate and help facilitate the Lead Now cohort here, the pre-day festival that was several days ago. And that's a cohort of seminarians and first call pastors. So all people are kind of just getting their feet wet in the work. And I led them in a futures workshop. And that futures workshop is not strategic planning. Strategic planning asks us to look at our past and then look at kind of 10 years in the future as to what we need. But all that's doing is kind of allowing us to learn from what we did before and plan for what we need to do again based on the successes that we had in the past. Futuring asks us to take into consideration all of the things that are happening in our world that are out of our control that are going to influence the church in 70 years. What are we going to do about AI in our churches? What are we going to do about the fact that, climate control, or our climate crisis is going to be taking away a third of our coastline churches over the next 50 years? Those kinds of things are things that have to be packaged in this wineskin conversation. And I think I love that you all are kind of taking this in, allowing those of us that are kind of still in ministry or are thinking about kind of what ministry looked like for us to figure out what's next. But we also have to wrestle with a lot of shit that we're bringing to the table and baggage that we're carrying with us when we get there.
Yep. Makes sense.
Thank you. Others, yeah. Matthew, come down here, Matthew. It kind of rings if you're out there. This is the Matthew and Alejandra that Ray was talking about that are villagers.
So what you just said really, so I work at a school. I'm looking at youth every day. I know, Stan, you work with a lot of youth. One of the things I love, and that's very sentimental, you talked about sentimentality. For me, it's sentimental to come to Wild Goose, to process my trauma, to deal with the parents that aren't coming to the wedding in a couple months, right? Like, that's a beautiful thing for me, and I see a lot of people doing that. I'm looking at a generation, talk about new wineskins. I follow about 250 TikTokers that are doing this for millions of folks on TikTok. So I wonder if that's a new wineskin. What do you think about the next generation who isn't going to necessarily be looking to process the same amount of trauma or grieve in the same way? They might be looking for something different, for a joy, for a celebration that isn't necessarily there right now in all these spaces. I'm just interested in what you see in the next generation.
Oh, that's great. Great thought.
Great question. Well, I will say this. I can't speak to the main line. The post-evangelical group, we did our deconstruction, and our kids got lost in that shuffle. Our kids are great kids, but they don't have a strong affinity for either the wine or the wineskin, frankly. They just don't. They were what, instead of we were training them up in the things they should get the hell away from, is what we were doing. And so there's a whole group right now of those of us that followed Brian McLaren for the last 20 years looking at our 20-year-old kids now, and they're not Christian. They don't have anything to do with church. They don't have a bunch of wounds. They're not sitting around talking about church trauma. They look at us like, that is pathetic.
Yeah.
How in the world? So there is a whole conversation, to be had there. Others, well, again, this is not in any way me thinking this little group or this time is going to come up with a new, some new fresh answer. I'm just saying, I think this conversation is actually more important than the wine conversation right now. I think we've been there, done that. It feels like Moses saying, you have encompassed this mountain long enough. My God, turn northward. Let's do something with this. Anyway, yes. This is the pastor, the UCC pastor.
So I think the new wineskin is Renee Bowman, who is sitting beside me, and I'm 8 years into a full-time pastorate in my 4th career. And when I got to Boone, North Carolina, I'm like, I'm in competition with Farm Cafe, which came out of our church. And for me, this is the new understanding of church, and the institution really, truly does have to die, because the ministry and the gift of inclusion and welcoming all has to look completely different. And so I actually have to give up of my job, and this job that creates a worship experience on a Sunday, because the people who love that, they're dying, and the people who want and need that, they don't want that and need that. And so church has to die, and the community cafes, the hospitality houses, the yoga studios, the coffee shops that are having the drag shows, that is the new ministry.
Yeah. Great. I say all the time, a friend of mine that does hospice work, I introduced her forever, this doula who helped people die. Finally, one day she pulled me aside and she said, you do realize I'm not helping people die, I'm helping them live their last days. And I realized at some point what we're doing, I want to be doing for the church, I'm a sentimental, I want to be doing OBGYN work. There is a level, sometimes I think what I'm doing, not for Christianity, not for Jesus, not for the way of Jesus, but for a way of life, I think I'm doing palliative hospice care for something that I have loved dearly that needs to go into the night graciously while a new is being born. And if what I'm doing is palliative care, then that is noble and good work, because Jesus said that old wineskin doesn't deserve to be torn. It deserves to be honored. That's why even changing our language, progressives can be so patronizing from, we're interpreting it right. No. We're coming to the text and saying, how can we interpret this most faithfully today without casting aspersions and continuing to grow? If we can bring that same graciousness and innovation to the wineskin side, what you just said is just lovely, and what Anna said is just spot on. We got 2 minutes, a couple more before we go. Yeah.
I just want to say that I'm not a minister of any kind. I'm one of the people, the dam givers, as John Palpovich said. When me and my wife first started dating, she asked me, do I believe in God? And I said, God, yes. Religion, no. I just want to say thank you because this is the first time I'm actually starting to believe in a religion. So, new wineskin is forming.
That's awesome. Thanks, Don. That's great.
That's really
Great.
I appreciate that. Hurry up.
I embrace my bigness. So what I want to say too, my name is Shakira. I was a middle school educator for over a decade. Now our kids may not have a level of reference for wineskin, but they have something that's equivalent. And what I feel like our duty is to not do is to not tell them, don't do that. Don't hamper their perception just because it's not the perception that the people who led us saw as a wineskin. All right, their wineskin may come from TikTok, okay? Their wineskin may come from going to Twitter, all right? Their wineskin may come from the video game that you wish they would hurry up and turn off, okay? And that's something I had to embrace as an educator over and over again because, you know, people say people change in 10 years. No, children change like day by day. And wineskins, as a black woman who is deconstructing, I'm reading a book by Keith Giles, and I don't know if he's here or not, but it's talking about before I lose my mind, deconstruction, the toxic theology, right? But I love one thing he said, reconstruct. And you reconstruct the way you need to reconstruct, not the way somebody is in your ear telling you to reconstruct. Because he said there's such thing as being so broke down, there's nothing. It's like the ruins. And so I want to say, I hope everybody can find the wineskin so that they're not left with ruins. And I hope you can love a child, whether they're 3, 5, 17, and as I learned in grad school, up to 25, because the mind does not fully mature until 25. Love them where they are at and let them have their wineskin however it shows up.
Good job. Thank you, Shakira.
Stan and Ray, thanks for the conversation. My name's Casey. I swore I wasn't going to talk about this while I was here, but I'm just discovering I'm a wild goose, so I'm having to spread those wings a little bit. I'm a 33-year veteran of contemporary Christian music business, so I know what the old wineskin looks like, and it can't handle the new wine.
Your kids are at GracePointe.
Yeah. Kids are at GracePointe. We're discovering GracePointe as well. What did I want to say? This is why I hate to speak. I freeze up. In as much as there are new winemakers, there are new wineskin makers too. That's just what I want to point out. And as much as we're wild geese in the wilderness, we're kind of just randomly finding each other, aren't we, on some level?
Great point.
Yeah, and we're uncomfortable with the ambiguity of that because as human beings, frankly, not only as past evangelicals, but as human beings, we're uncomfortable with uncertainty. You know, my friend and I, our favorite quote is Anne Lamott, you know, the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty, right? And so I'm just posing to the group that, you know, maybe that's part of the new space we're in, is that we're out in this beautiful, random, creative wilderness that's just awesome. And you guys are exploring it as winemakers. But I know some wineskin makers that are already exploring it. I'm going to throw one out there, Common Hymnal, commonhymnal.com on the music side. Go check it out. They're exploring new spaces and ways to do that. So I'm excited about that.
That's great.
Yeah?
I love it.
Okay?
Thanks.